This is a database that we will implement in our application. We have a city, a zip code, an author, a book, a category entity. We will write their mappings using Spring annotations. The city and the zip code entities will have a one-to-one relationship. This means that city can only have one zip code and zip code can only have one city. This relationship is a unidirectional relationship, and this means that zip code has a reference to the city entity, but city does not have a reference to the zip code entity. The author and zip code entities will have a one-to-many relationship. This means that author can only have one zip code, a zip code can have multiple authors. This relationship is also a unidirectional relationship. This means that author entity has a reference to zip code entity, but zip code does not have a reference to the author entity. The author and book entities will have a many-to-many relationship. This means that author can have multiple books and books can have multiple authors. This relationship is a bidirectional relationship. This means that book entity has a reference to the author entity and the author entity has a reference to the book entity. The book and category entities will have a many-to-one relationship. This means that a category will have multiple books, but book can only have one category. This relationship is also a bidirectional relationship, and this means that category entity will have a reference to the books, and books entity will have a reference to the category entity. We map our relationship with JPA annotations. Those annotations start with an @ symbol and then their types, and we place those annotations on top of our fields. The join column annotation indicates that this entity is the owner of the relationship, and the map by attribute indicates that this entity is the inverse of the relationship and that the owner resides in the author. Let's build our application. Go to Spring Initializer. Select the project Maven, language Java, and the version 2.6.3. Select the group name, data JPA, and the artifact name, relationship. We also need the dependencies. We need the Lombok dependency, Spring Web dependency, the Spring Data JPA dependency, and the H2 dependency. Click up Generate. Open your project in IntelliJ and we will start with writing our entities. Create a package named model. In this package, we will create our 5 entities. The first entity is the city entity. The second one is the zip code entity. The third one is the author entity. The fourth one is the book entity. And the last one is the category entity. Open your city entity and we will start with writing our annotations. The first annotation is the entity annotation. Oops. The second one is the data annotation. And this is a Lombok annotation, and this will provide us with the getters and setters. The next one is the noArgs constructor. And this is also a Lombok annotation. And the last one is the table annotation. And this will give our entity a name in our database. And we will name it city. Now copy those annotations and we will place them on top of our other entities. And change the name to zip codes. Copy it in category. Oops. paste it also in the book entity. And also in the author entity. Once again, open your city entity. I will start with writing our fields. The first field is the ID field with type long. Second one is the name field with the type of string. On top of our ID field, we need two annotations. The first annotation is the ID annotation, and the second one is the generated value annotation. And this will tell Hibernate how to create this ID in the database with strategy auto. You also need a constructor for a name. And our city entity is done. Now let's go to the zip code entity. The first field is the ID field with type long. The second one is the name field with the type string. And the third one is the city field with the type city. And we need this field for our mapping. On top of our ID field, we need two annotations, the ID field, the ID annotation and the generated value annotation. On top of our city field, we need two annotations. The first one is the type of mapping, one-to-one, with cascade type, all. Our second annotation will be the join column annotation. And this will create an additional column in our entity to store our city ID. Name city. We also need a constructor for the zip code entity with a field with string and city. And this entity is done. Now let's go to the author entity. Our first field is the ID field with type long. The second field is the name field with the type string. Our third field is the zip code field, and we will need this field for our mapping. And our last field is the books field, and we will also need this for our mapping. And this will be a list, so we can add multiple books to the author entity. New array lists. Let's create a constructor. Now, on top of our ID field, we need two annotations. The first one is the ID annotation, and the second one is the generated value annotation. On top of our zip code field, we need two annotations. The first one is the many-to-one annotation with cascading type all and fetch lazy. We also need to join column annotation. And we need to name this column with the ID of the zip code. On top of our book field, we need one annotation, and this is the many-to-many annotation. We need to define how it's mapped, because this will be the inverse of our mapping. mapped by categories, or cascade type will be all, and our fetch type will be lazy. We also need to be able to add books and remove books from this entity. So let's create that. Public void add book and type book. Books add book. We also need to be able to remove books. Public void remove book. Book. Books. Now our author entity is done. Let's go to the book entity. Our first field will be the private long ID. Second one will be our name field, and this will be of type string. Our third field will be the author field, and this will be a list because we can have multiple authors in a book. And import the list package. And our last field will be the category field. Now, on top of our ID field, we need two annotations. And the second one will be the generate value with strategy auto. On top of our author field, we need two annotations. The first one is the many-to-many annotation with cascade type all and fetch type lazy. Our second annotation will be the join table annotation, and this will create a new table. First, we need to define the name of the table. This will be book underscore author. Now we need to define the two columns, join column with add join columns with name book ID and the inverse of join column. With name on top of our category field, we need two annotations. The first one will be the many-to-one with cascade type all and fetch type lazy. Second annotation will be the join column annotation, and this will create an additional column with name category ID. For this entity, we will need a constructor with the fields name, author, and category. We also need to be able to add and delete authors as public void add author. Author. We also need to be able to delete authors. Like void delete author. Remove author. And now our books entity is also done. Let's write our last entity. Our category entity will have 3 fields. The first field will be the ID field with the type long. The second one will be our name field with the type of string. And the last one will be the book field with the type of book. And this will be a list because a category can have multiple books. And let's initialize this list. New. On top of our ID field, we need 2 annotations. The first one will be the ID annotation. The second one will be our generated value annotation with strategy auto. On top of our books field, we need a one-to-many mapping annotation that will be mapped by category with cascade type all and fetch type lazy. We also need a constructor. And now our entities are done. Sources file and copy this script. This is the port and this is all the database settings. Now we can run our application. The first time it may take a while. We have an error. Let's look at it. I will pause the video and look what this error is and solve it. I have found the error. Go to the author model and change the categories to category because we mapped by category and in the book model the name is category and not categories. It would have been correct if this was categories, but because there is only one category, it would not make sense to write it as category, so category is a better option. Now our application is running. Type in localhost 880-H2 and make sure you have this URL and connect. Now we can go to the authors and run. We can see that we have an author named Ahmed with zip code 2 and the ID of that author is 4. We have also a book to author table. Let's run it. And we can see that the author has added to the book. And this is a Spring generated table. Let's go to the city and run it. We can see that the city is added with the ID 1. Now I'm not going to test each and every endpoint, but you can do that on your own time. I'm going to finish the video. Thanks for watching. And if you liked the video, consider subscribing and like the video.